I never thought a day meant to say goodbye to my only son would also become the day I stopped feeling like I mattered in my own family. The moment I stepped into the St. Patrick Funeral Home in Boston, Massachusetts, something in the air already felt wrong, like the silence itself was holding its breath. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 70 years old, and I had just lost my son Daniel, the child I raised with every ounce of strength I had left after his father passed years ago. I expected grief, I expected tears, I expected quiet respect, but I did not expect the cold distance from the one person who was supposed to stand beside me, my daughter-in-law, Emily Carter. She was already there, dressed in black, sitting too straight, her eyes dry in a way that did not match the weight of the room. At first, people called it strength, but I knew better. I had lived long enough to recognize when silence is not peace, but distance carefully built. As guests began arriving, I noticed something small but unsettling, the way Emily positioned herself between me and the front row seats, as if even in death my place beside my son had to be negotiated. I stayed quiet, telling myself this was not the time, not the place, but grief has a way of making even small gestures feel like messages written in plain sight. I tried to sit near Daniel's casket, where I thought I belonged, but Emily gently, almost politely, told me there was not enough space, her voice soft enough for others to think it was kindness. Still, I felt the weight behind it, a quiet decision being made without me. People moved around us offering condolences, handshakes, soft murmurs, but I noticed Emily responding with practiced grace, as if she was performing a role she had rehearsed long before today. At one point, I overheard her speaking to a distant relative about responsibility, about how some people do not understand modern family boundaries, and I stood there wondering when I had become someone she needed to explain away. The room filled slowly, the smell of flowers growing heavier as more arrangements arrived, each card reminding me of a life I thought I knew better than anyone else. I kept telling myself to stay composed, to focus on Daniel, not on the tension building quietly around me. But then came the moment that changed everything. Emily leaned slightly toward a guest standing beside her, her expression calm, almost neutral, and in a voice that was just loud enough to travel. She said she was not taking care of that old witch. For a second, I thought I had misheard, that grief had twisted sound itself, but then I saw the slight shift in the guest's expression, the uncomfortable glance away, the realization that what was said could not be unsaid. I did not speak. I did not react. I simply stood still as the weight of those words settled into the space between us, heavier than any flower or condolence card in the room. And in that moment, surrounded by people mourning my son, I began to understand that this funeral was not only about goodbye, it was about something far more painful beginning right in front of me. I stood there long after those words were spoken, unable to move, as if the floor beneath the funeral home had quietly shifted and left me in a place I no longer recognized. People continued to pass by with soft voices and polite condolences, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the same room in silence. Emily Carter had already turned away, adjusting her posture, smoothing her dress, and greeting the next guest as if nothing unusual had happened, as if she had not just reduced a lifetime of motherhood into something disposable. I watched her carefully, trying to understand how grief could look so controlled on her face, while mine felt like it was unraveling in real time. A distant cousin touched my arm and offered kind words about Daniel, but even her voice felt far away, like I was hearing everything underwater. I found myself drifting toward the front again, drawn to the presence of the closed casket, needing something stable to focus on, something that still belonged to my son without negotiation. But Emily stepped slightly into my path again, not aggressively, not visibly hostile, but with a subtle firmness that made it clear my movement was being noticed and redirected. She spoke softly to a group nearby about arrangements, about responsibilities, about how things would be handled going forward, and I realized she was already speaking as if decisions had been made without me. I stood just close enough to hear fragments, phrases about boundaries and independence and family structure, words that sounded reasonable to everyone else, but felt like quiet exclusions aimed directly at me. I remembered how Daniel used to laugh in the kitchen of our home in Ohio when things felt simple, when family meant shared meals and not carefully drawn lines between people who once sat at the same table. That memory felt distant now, almost unreal, as if it belonged to a different version of this family that no longer existed. Emily moved through the room with practiced calm, accepting embraces, offering thank yous, positioning herself as the center of attention while I felt myself slowly being pushed to the edge of every interaction. At one point, I overheard her speaking to a friend of Daniel's about the future, mentioning how some people struggle with letting go and adapting, and I felt a quiet sting because I knew I was meant to be included in that category without her ever saying my name. I wanted to speak, to correct the growing impression that I was somehow an obstacle rather than a mother in mourning, but every time I tried to find the right moment, the room seemed to close around me with new conversations and new distractions. Even the flowers seemed louder than my voice, their presence overwhelming everything else, covering the silence I was trying to fill. I realized then that this was not just about what had been said earlier. It was about something larger forming in front of me, a rewriting of roles that was happening in real time while I stood still inside it. And as the afternoon continued, I began to understand that the most painful part of being there was not the loss of my son, but the slow realization that I was being treated as someone who no longer had a place in the story he left behind. I could no longer tell how much time had passed inside the funeral home, because everything began to feel like it was happening in slow motion while people around me continued to act as if life was still normal. Emily Carter remained at the center of every conversation, her voice steady, her gestures controlled, as if she had rehearsed this exact moment long before today ever arrived. I stood slightly apart, close enough to see everything but far enough to feel invisible, and that distance felt intentional even if no one ever said it out loud. A woman from Daniel's work approached me briefly, offering condolences and asking gentle questions, but before I could respond fully, Emily was already stepping in, redirecting the conversation toward logistics and arrangements, as if emotional space itself had to be managed. I noticed how naturally she spoke about the future, using words like responsibility and structure, words that sounded practical but carried an unspoken message that I was not part of those plans. My hands felt cold even though the room was warm, and I kept telling myself to focus on Daniel, to stay present for him. But even that thought was being pulled away from me by the way others avoided looking directly at me for too long. At one point, I saw Emily standing near a small group of relatives, and I heard her mention that certain boundaries needed to be respected moving forward, that grief should not interfere with clarity, and I understood without being named that I was included in what she considered interference. I thought back to years earlier, when Daniel first introduced her to me, when I told myself to be patient, to give her time to adjust, never imagining that patience would eventually turn into silence directed at me. A soft piano track played somewhere in the background of the funeral home, barely noticeable, but it made every word spoken feel heavier, as if even the air was participating in the quiet separation happening around me. I walked slowly toward a corner of the room where I could see the entire space, trying to understand how I had gone from being the mother of the man in the coffin to someone who needed to justify simply standing nearby. Emily passed by me once, close enough that I could hear her speaking about next steps with someone on the phone, her tone calm and efficient, and not once did she look uncertain or shaken. That steadiness unsettled me more than any raised voice could have, because it suggested certainty in a situation where I still felt completely unanchored. I noticed how guests began to follow her lead naturally, looking to her for direction, as if she had become the reference point for what came next, while I remained anchored to what had already ended. I thought about the house in Ohio where Daniel grew up, the photographs still on the walls, the kitchen table where so many conversations once happened without hesitation or exclusion, and I wondered when that version of family had quietly been replaced by something so carefully divided. The realization did not come all at once, but in small pieces, each interaction reinforcing the same silent message that I was no longer being included in decisions that affected my own son's memory. And as I stood there watching Emily continue to move through the room with quiet authority, I understood that what was happening was not confusion or misunderstanding, but a shift in power that I had not been invited to witness, only to accept. I did not realize how quickly a funeral could turn into something that felt less like mourning and more like a quiet rearrangement of people's places within a family that was supposed to still belong to me. Emily Carter had not changed her demeanor at all, If anything, she had become even more composed, as if the earlier moments of tension had only confirmed her control rather than shaken it. I stayed near the side of the room, watching as she moved from group to group, offering soft words and measured expressions that made others naturally lean toward her for direction. It was not loud, it was not obvious, but it was consistent enough that I began to notice how easily influence can shift when no one is paying attention to the details. A few guests asked me simple questions about Daniel, about memories, about arrangements, but their attention rarely stayed long before drifting back toward Emily, as if she had become the central point of gravity in a room that used to revolve around something else. I found myself answering in short phrases, not because I had nothing to say, but because every conversation seemed to dissolve before it could fully form. At one point, I stood near a table of flowers arranged by close friends, and I noticed a small card with Daniel's name written in careful handwriting, and I realized how strange it felt that something so personal could exist alongside such emotional distance in the same space. Emily walked past again, this time speaking quietly with someone from the funeral home staff, her tone calm and precise, discussing timing and next steps as if the day had already moved beyond grief and into planning. I remember thinking that grief was supposed to slow everything down, but instead it felt like I was the only one still moving at that pace, while everyone else had already shifted forward. I tried to recall Daniel's voice, the way he used to call me on Sunday mornings just to check in, but even those memories felt fragile, like they might slip away if I stopped focusing on them for too long. Emily paused briefly near the center of the room, listening to someone speak, and nodded with the kind of certainty that made others follow her lead without question, and I noticed how naturally people began to align themselves around her decisions without ever asking mine. I felt a quiet pressure building inside me, not anger, but something heavier, like the realization that I was being gradually removed from conversations that still involved my own son. I moved closer to the edge of the seating area again, hoping that proximity might bring clarity, but instead it only made the contrast more visible between those who were included in planning and those who were simply present. I thought about the years I spent supporting Daniel, the sacrifices made without hesitation, the belief that family would always remain connected through shared history, and I began to understand that history alone was not enough to guarantee presence in the present. Emily's voice reached me again as she spoke about keeping things simple going forward, about avoiding unnecessary complications, and I realized that what she considered simplicity might mean something very different for me. And as I stood there surrounded by polite conversations and careful arrangements, I understood that the most unsettling part was not what had been said directly, but the growing certainty that decisions were already being made in a space where I was slowly becoming invisible. I no longer felt like time inside the funeral home was moving in a straight line, because every moment seemed to fold over itself, repeating the same quiet message in different forms that I was no longer being included in what was happening around my own son. Emily Carter continued to move through the space with the same steady control, speaking softly with guests, offering small nods, and guiding conversations away from anything that might return attention to me for too long. I noticed how naturally people responded to her, how quickly they adjusted their tone when she entered a circle, and how slowly I was being left out of those same circles without anyone needing to say it directly. At one point, I stood near the hallway leading toward the preparation rooms, and I overheard her speaking with a funeral home coordinator about timing, transportation, and next steps, her voice calm and precise, as if every detail had already been approved somewhere I was not part of. I remember feeling a strange disconnect in my chest, not sharp enough to call pain, but heavy enough to make it difficult to focus on anything else in the room. I tried to remind myself that grief often creates confusion, that people act differently under pressure, but what I was seeing was not confusion, it was structure, and I was not inside it. A guest passed by me and asked quietly if I needed anything, but before I could answer, Emily appeared beside them and smoothly redirected the conversation back toward arrangements, as if even a simple question directed at me required correction. I stepped back slightly, watching how easily my presence was being bypassed, and I began to understand that exclusion does not always need force, sometimes it only needs consistency. My thoughts drifted briefly to Daniel's childhood home in Ohio, The way he used to sit at the kitchen table telling me about his plans, his voice full of certainty that life would always stay connected to family, and I felt something inside me tighten at the distance between those memories and the reality unfolding in front of me. Emily paused near the center of the room again, speaking with someone from Daniel's workplace, and I heard phrases about moving forward and keeping things simple, words that sounded reasonable to everyone listening, but felt like quiet erasure when directed at everything I represented. I realized then that I was not being openly rejected in a single moment, but gradually repositioned in a way that made resistance feel unnecessary to others. Even my attempts to participate began to feel out of place, as if I were stepping into conversations that had already decided I did not belong in them. I watched Emily's expression carefully, searching for hesitation, uncertainty, anything that suggested this was difficult for her. But what I saw instead was consistency, and that consistency unsettled me more than conflict ever could have. I began to notice how guests unconsciously followed her lead when choosing where to stand, when to speak, when to move, as if she had become the center of an invisible structure that replaced what used to be shared. And in that realization, standing quietly near the edge of a room filled with polite voices and careful gestures, I understood that the most painful part was not being ignored in a single moment, but recognizing that the entire space had slowly been rearranged so that my absence would feel natural rather than forced. I did not expect silence to become something that could feel so loud inside a room, filled with people speaking in soft voices. Yet that is exactly what I began to experience as I stood slightly apart from the center of everything happening around Daniel's funeral. Emily Carter continued moving with the same steady control, but there was something sharper now in the way she handled conversations, as if the earlier tension had settled into certainty rather than discomfort. I noticed how she no longer paused to acknowledge me at all unless absolutely necessary, and even then her attention felt brief, almost procedural, as if I were a detail that needed to be managed rather than a person who belonged there. A few guests approached me with kindness, but each interaction seemed to dissolve quickly, redirected almost immediately toward Emily, who would step in with calm authority and continue guiding the conversation toward arrangements, timing, and next steps. I found myself standing still more often than not because I chose to, but because there was nowhere natural for me to move within the flow of the room anymore. At one point, I watched as Emily spoke with a close friend of Daniel's, her tone soft but deliberate, mentioning how things needed to remain simple and organized going forward, and I saw the other person nod without question, accepting her direction as if it was already established truth. I remember feeling a quiet tightening in my chest as I realized that even decisions about my own son were being discussed in a way that no longer included me as a participant. I tried to focus on the physical details of the room, the arrangement of chairs, the soft lighting, the distant sound of footsteps on polished floors, anything that could anchor me away from the growing sense of displacement. But every detail seemed to reinforce the same pattern, that I was present but not positioned, visible but not included. Emily passed near me again while speaking to someone from the funeral home staff, her voice low and precise, and I noticed how effortlessly she transitioned between personal conversations and logistical instructions without breaking her composure. It was in that contrast that I began to understand how influence can be maintained without confrontation, simply through consistency and the quiet acceptance of others. I thought back to the early years when Daniel first built his life with Emily, how I convinced myself that time would naturally blend families together, never imagining that time could also create separation without any clear moment of rupture. A guest nearby asked about memories of Daniel, and I began to speak, but halfway through my sentence I noticed the listener's attention drift toward Emily again, as if even stories about my own son were being measured against her presence in the room. I stopped speaking, not because I had nothing left to say, but because continuing felt like trying to speak in a language that no longer held equal weight. Emily paused near the center of the space once more, offering brief responses to multiple people at once, and I observed how easily she absorbed attention without ever appearing to demand it. And as I stood there watching the quiet redirection of every interaction, I finally understood that what was happening was not a series of individual moments, but a steady rewriting of who held place in the memory of the man we were all there to mourn. I began to understand that grief does not always look the way people expect it to look, because inside that funeral home in Boston, Massachusetts, grief was no longer the center of what I was experiencing. It had slowly been replaced by something quieter and far more disorienting, a feeling of being present without being recognized. Emily Carter continued speaking with calm certainty to those around her, and I noticed how easily her words shaped the direction of every conversation, as if she had become the reference point for how everyone else should respond. I stood near the side of the room again, close enough to hear, but far enough to realize that what I said rarely held its place for long before attention shifted elsewhere. A man from Daniel's workplace approached me briefly, asking about memories of my son, and I tried to answer carefully. But halfway through I noticed Emily moving closer, and the conversation naturally shifted toward her explanation of upcoming arrangements and timing. It was not abrupt, it was not rude, it was simply efficient, and that efficiency made it harder to challenge because nothing felt openly wrong, yet everything felt subtly displaced. I remember thinking that Daniel would have noticed this immediately, the way he used to pay attention to small shifts in tone and behavior that others missed, but now I was the only one left holding those memories in a room that seemed to be moving forward without them. Emily's presence had become consistent in a way that made resistance feel unnecessary to others, and I could see it in the way guests looked to her before speaking, as if confirmation was already assumed. I found myself stepping back more often, not because I wanted distance, but because every attempt to step forward felt like interrupting a flow that had already chosen its direction. At one point, I heard her speaking softly about keeping everything simple and respectful for everyone involved, and I realized that simplicity in her words seemed to mean exclusion without conflict, removal without confrontation. I thought about how long I had known her, how many family gatherings I had attended believing that shared history would naturally create shared space, and I began to see how mistaken that belief had been. A chair near the front remained empty for a long time, and I found myself wondering whether that emptiness was accidental or intentional, because even absence now seemed to carry meaning in this room. When I moved slightly closer to the center again, I noticed how quickly conversations adjusted their direction, how smoothly people recalibrated their attention, and I understood that influence does not always need to be declared. It only needs to be accepted by those around it. Emily passed near me once more, her voice steady as she discussed final details with someone from the funeral home staff, and I realized she no longer hesitated in any interaction, as if every part of the day already belonged to her interpretation of it. I stood there listening to fragments of conversations that no longer included me as a reference point, and I felt the weight of something settling in slowly, not sudden enough to call a moment, but persistent enough to change everything I understood about where I stood in relation to my own son's memory. I did not notice the exact moment everything inside the room began to feel different, but I could sense a shift forming in the way people were no longer just reacting to Emily Carter, but actively orienting themselves around her, as if she had become the quiet center of every decision being made that day. I stood near the edge of the seating area, watching as she continued speaking with calm precision to different groups, her tone never rising, never wavering, yet somehow carrying enough weight that others adjusted their behavior without hesitation. A few guests still approached me with sympathy, but even those brief exchanges felt interrupted before they could fully form, as if the space itself was guiding attention away from me and back toward the structure Emily was shaping. I remember trying to hold on to small details, like the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the soft rustle of programs being handed out, the distant hum of conversations blending together, anything that might keep me grounded in the present moment. But every detail seemed to reinforce the same reality, that I was no longer being included in the natural flow of discussion about Daniel, even though I was his mother and the person who had known him the longest. At one point, I saw Emily speaking with a close friend of Daniel's, and I heard fragments of conversation about how everything needed to remain organized and respectful, and I realized that even emotional language was being filtered through her interpretation before it reached anyone else. I felt a quiet heaviness settle in my thoughts, not sudden or dramatic, but steady, like understanding something that had already been decided long before I was aware of it. I tried to step closer to a group near the front, But the conversation naturally shifted as Emily approached, and within moments the focus moved away from me, without any clear interruption or explanation. It was not rejection in the traditional sense. It was something far more subtle, a gradual redirection that made my presence feel optional rather than essential. I thought about Daniel's childhood again, about the way he used to call me every Sunday afternoon no matter how busy his life became, and I realized how distant those moments felt compared to the structured quiet of the room I was standing in now. Emily's voice carried again as she spoke about final arrangements, her words steady and confident, and I noticed how easily others accepted her direction without question, as if she had already been designated as the person responsible for interpreting what should come next. I remained still for a long moment, observing rather than participating, and I began to understand that silence in this context was not emptiness, it was organization. Even the smallest gestures from her, a nod, a brief glance, a quiet instruction, seemed to shape the movement of everyone around her more effectively than any formal announcement ever could. I felt myself stepping back again, not physically pushed, but gradually guided into a space where observation replaced participation. And as I stood there watching the final details of the day being arranged without my input, I understood that what I was witnessing was not just a funeral, but the quiet consolidation of a new order within a family that I was still grieving, but no longer fully part of. I remember the moment the atmosphere inside the funeral home began to feel less like a place of farewell and more like a place where something irreversible had already been decided without my participation, and I stood there with the realization slowly forming that I was no longer being treated as a central part of my own son Daniel's final day. Emily Carter was still moving with the same calm precision, speaking softly to guests, acknowledging condolences, and guiding every interaction toward what she defined as next steps, and I noticed how naturally people followed her direction, without hesitation, as if she had quietly become the authority in a space that once belonged equally to all of us. I remained near the side of the room, watching rather than engaging, and I could feel the subtle distance growing between me and every conversation that passed through the air like it no longer needed my input to continue. At one point, I saw Emily pause near the front where Daniel's casket rested, and she spoke briefly with a man in a dark suit I had not noticed earlier, and something about the way he carried himself made the room feel slightly more focused, as if a new presence had entered with purpose rather than grief. The man introduced himself to a small group first, then gradually turned toward where I was standing, and I felt an unfamiliar tension rise not because of fear, but because of uncertainty about what role I still held in what was unfolding. Emily stepped aside without hesitation, allowing him to speak, and I noticed how seamlessly she created space for him, as if this moment had been anticipated. The man spoke calmly, identifying himself as the family attorney, and mentioned Daniel's name with careful respect before explaining that there were final instructions that needed to be acknowledged in accordance with legal documentation prepared prior to Daniel's passing. I felt my breath slow as I listened, not fully understanding at first why this moment felt different from everything that had happened before, but sensing that something private was about to become public in a way that could not be redirected. Emily stood slightly behind him, her expression unchanged, and I realized she already knew what was coming, which meant I was the only one still waiting to understand. The attorney continued, explaining that Daniel had made specific arrangements regarding his estate and personal wishes, and I noticed how the room shifted its attention entirely away from mourning and toward expectation, as if grief itself had paused to allow something else to take its place. I thought about every conversation I had been excluded from that day, every moment where decisions had moved forward without me, and I began to understand that those smaller displacements were not random, but connected to something structured beneath the surface. The attorney then confirmed that certain instructions had been updated shortly before Daniel's passing, and I felt a quiet stillness settle over me, not dramatic, not explosive, but deeply clarifying in a way that made everything before it feel like preparation. Emily did not look at me, not once, and that absence of acknowledgement felt heavier than any word that had been spoken in the room so far. And as I stood there listening to the final confirmation of decisions I had not been part of, I understood that the day was no longer only about loss, but about the revelation of how completely the definition of family could change when I was not being asked to witness the change until it was already complete.